We're going to delve deeper into your personal project and those photos soon, but I wanted to ask Louisa a little bit about this political situation in Iraq. The fact that you've been in this country, you've been reporting from this country for years now, and you've seen the evolution, the post-US invasion, and then a few years back, the youth protest. Like, can you tell us a little bit about how the mood in Iraq and Baghdad has changed over these past few years?
But I think it's it's interesting, Salwan says that he left a country that wasn't livable. And you spin forward to 2023 and it looks very different, right? Life is not as it was under sanctions. But at the same time, now 20 years after the invasion, there are all these other ways in which it's not livable, right? You can buy food in the shops, but as Salwan says, there is not electricity, the water isn't drinkable, the air is frankly, toxic. And so when you think about the situation for the youth, this is 3 years after they had this mass uprising where they really, for the first time, tried to sort of take their future into their own hands. There isn't open violence on the street. So there should be this, I suppose, this space for progress, this space for people to start living a dignified life. And that is what hasn't happened because of the way that the political system has developed. What happened after 2003, the Americans spoke of regime change. That was what they said they were doing. They were going in to remove Saddam, and then the quote from George W. Bush was about how they were coming to liberate and to free Iraqis. They didn't do regime change. What they actually did was total, they decimated the state. The process of de-Baathification basically involved removing civil servants from all of the upper echelons of the state, which means that the generation that we see now who are in the youth protests and who are all over Iraq, they've grown up with an education system and a health system and all these other systems that were totally decimated in 2003. They were already doing pretty badly under sanctions, but any expertise that existed pretty much was taken out. And in the years that followed, what has replaced what was taken out is fundamentally incredibly corrupt, never really has the money spent on it that it's meant to. Public institutions have been gutted. It's hard to get a job without a bribe. It's a pretty dire situation for them, even if, you see in these photos, there's not really any violence out on the streets in the sense of open conflict, but that doesn't make life good or really particularly dignified.
And a few years back, like just before the pandemic, you had this youth uprising, like against that corruption and against that failed political and societal structure. Can you you witnessed those protests? Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, sure. So, again, for this generation, the one thing they've never had is control. Going back to the rhetoric of the Americans and what was meant to happen, the one thing they didn't get was a real democracy. The one thing they didn't get was choice over their future. First, it was Saddam controlling things, then it was the Americans, then it was the sectarian militias, then ISIS, etc. And in 2019, small-scale protests that were pretty normal on October 1st were fired upon by riot police. And all of a sudden, really, it was like the dam had burst. These youth protesters came to Tahrir Square in Baghdad and to squares across the mostly Shiite south of the country, and they stayed. And what had begun as a sort of small-scale cry against corruption turned into a revolt against the entire system. When you read the media, particularly when I moved to Iraq, I was you're very aware that when you read news stories about Iraq, it's always about who is Sunni, who is Shia, who is Christian. These were categories that the media really liked to sort of emphasize, to sort of as if it said a lot about a person. But what happened in these protests were people were saying no. Sectarianism in particular was imposed on them after 2003, and they are sick and tired of being identified as this group or the other. The biggest division in society at this stage is the sort of elite against the people, particularly the youth. And they sang and they danced and they called for the overthrow of the entire system. And really it posed something of an existential challenge to a system that was incredibly strong. And to fight back, as the system did, it showed how resilient it was. And, you know, I've covered a lot of street protests in my time working in the Middle East. And it was probably the single most violent, or one of the most violent crackdowns against street protesters that I have seen in countries that didn't go to war. You know, even us, we were riding in ambulances that were picking up wounded protesters and we were fired upon. Protesters were kidnapped nearly every day. They had stun grenades fired literally into their heads. It was remarkably violent. And by the end, almost 600 people were killed, 20,000 people were wounded. And this generation that had tried so hard to say, no, you know, this is our time, we want our future. I think a lot of them realized that the system that had grown up with them, you know, this political system, was stronger, and ultimately it prevailed.
Yeah, and I'm sure that the pandemic and all the lockdown did not help that movement.
Yeah, not at all. I mean, the interesting thing you get is you have this sense of hope that people had in 2019. You know, for a brief period, it really seemed like things they hoped could be better. People were standing shoulder to shoulder and they were together. And the protests sort of wound down in stages, but the time that they finally were cleared was with COVID. And so the people who had held out had gone from being all together, all in this square, to being stuck inside their homes, completely unable to go out, going through this, you know, this pandemic with the world. And I think it really contributed to a very serious depression among a lot of them. You know, people talk about the failure, maybe the short-term failure of this movement as akin to heartbreak, you know, this crushing sense that they had tried so hard and they had believed so much, and suddenly they're all stuck in their homes. They can't go out, they can't see each other. People stop texting each other because they feel too, you know, down or depressed. And I think for a lot of them, there is now a question about not what it is to be Iraqi, but what it is to be citizens in their country, you know, after really seeing the reality of the power structures made manifest, the post-2003 power structures. You know, these are ones which were created and imposed by the Americans, and you know what it is to live there now.